Get started. Hello, everyone. I'm Joanne Gabriel, and on behalf of Darien Library, I want to welcome you to our lecture this evening, Stephen Sondheim's Into the Woods with Gil Harel. Gil returns this evening to continue the story of Sondheim with an impressive resume of award-winning shows under his belt, shows like Sweeney Todd and Sunday in the Park with George. Tonight, we will turn our attention to Into the Woods, a fairy tale themed musical that tackles timeless topics such as responsibility, maturity, dreams, and wishes. Before we begin, I would like to mention that programs at Darien Library are made possible by the annual Friends of the Library campaign. We thank you for your support to make programs like this possible and our collections available to the community. Our presenter this evening has a PhD from Brandeis University and is a musicologist and music theorist whose interests include styles ranging from Western classical repertoire to jazz and musical theater. Previously, he served on the faculty at CUNY Brewer College, where he was awarded the prestigious Presidential Excellence Award for Distinguished Teaching and is currently an associate professor of music at Naugatuck Valley Community College. Current accolades include the AFT Merit Award for Exemplary Service to the College for 4 consecutive years and the 2020 Connecticut Board of Regents Teaching Award. At NBCC, Dr. Harel conducts the College Chorale a cappella ensemble, teaches music history and theory, and serves as the musical director of theater productions. Please welcome Gil Harel.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much, Joanne, for that introduction, and thank you to everybody for joining me this evening. I would just like to begin by saying that there understandably is a malaise that has perhaps settled over many of us today due to recent world events, and it's times like this where we can remember that theater serves as a balm, a panacea, an elixir for the soul, a chance for us to indulge our imaginations in something thought-provoking and something orally and sonically rewarding, and obviously to remind ourselves that beautiful things exist out there and that they are part of the human condition, and that in the best of circumstances, theater can provide us that escape that allows us to really appreciate the humanistic side of what it means to be alive. And that is just a little bit of a preamble before we get down to business. We are, of course, talking tonight about the 1987 masterpiece, Into the Woods. This is a collaboration between Stephen Sondheim and James Lapine. Now, some of you will recall that we looked in our last program in January at Sunday in the Park with George from 1984, yet another collaboration between Sondheim and Lapine. Part of the reason I chose Into the Woods is that it is in many ways a sort of a very diametrically opposed musical in terms of its architecture, its structure, and its musical attributes when compared to George. In other words, gives us an opportunity to witness firsthand the versatility and the incredible dexterity, if I can use that word, that Sondheim wielded through his composer's pencil, and how he and Lapine fashioned a story together cobbled from traditional fairy tales that will be very recognizable to just about everybody on the call. For example, the characters who appear in the very first opening number, which is an opening number of staggering scope, something that really has no parallel in anything in musical theater. It's something like 12 or 13 minutes long in a typical production, and it's divided up into 9 parts. That's the opening number, which is called Into the Woods. It introduces us to some of the most important leitmotifs in the musical, and these are themes that will be associated with characters or sometimes ideas that are important and of central, paramount relevance to the plot and to what this musical is really about. Now, we're going to get into that. We'll spend the better part of the next hour plus talking about exactly that. But since we are sort of scratching the surface, I think it makes sense to start with the fairy tale elements. Some of the characters that you'll see on stage in the opening scene will include, for example, Cinderella. They'll include Rapunzel, Jack of Jack and the Beanstalk fame, and of course, Little Red Riding Hood. Most of these characters come from stories that are derived from German mythology, specifically the Brothers Grimm. For example, Rapunzel is a story from the Brothers Grimm. Little Red Riding Hood has many incarnations, but the most famous version is the one from the Brothers Grimm. Jack and the Beanstalk comes from an old English, an 18th century English fairy tale. And the truth about Cinderella is that it predates all of these stories by many years and probably many, many centuries. In fact, there are some scholars who suggest that there are antecedents to the Cinderella story that go all the way back to the ancient Greeks. So whether it comes from 19th century German literature, or whether it comes from 18th century English literature, these characters are very familiar to us. It's worth pointing out, by the way, that the original incarnation of these various fairy tales are often much darker, sometimes much more tortured, much more agonized, and much more, I would say, not child themed than the versions that we share with our children today. And Into the Woods, it must be said, preserves a lot of that darkness. This is a story that, while it is very funny, the musical should be a musical that one laughs at quite often, many scenes, but it's also a very dark, very grim, and occasionally very gory story. Many of the characters wind up dead by the end. Some are trampled to death by a marauding, vengeful giantess. Some are killed through perfidy and betrayal. And one of them, at the end of the first act, we have a scene where Cinderella's evil stepsisters have their own feet mutilated so that they can try to fit it into the slipper so that the prince might choose them. So some of the darkness and the macabre character of the original fairy tales is preserved in Into the Woods. And that's one of the features, I think, that really elevates the story, that is to say, authentic preservation of the source material. If that didn't give you a window into what you can expect from this musical, let me clarify and say it very, very openly. This is a show that is about far more than the fluffy fairy tales that we're used to hearing, or we heard as children, we're used to sharing with our children now. These are not happily ever after stories. The ending of the first act concludes with a song called Happily Ever After. But notice what I said. That's the ending of the first act. The ending of the second act is in many ways totally different. And it's not really until the end of the second act that the various characters, at least those who survive, experience an epiphany of sorts, a light bulb moment where they think, aha, and they grow and they mature. And that's where the moral, I think, of this musical becomes very apparent. But as we might expect from a lyrical genius like Stephen Sondheim and an incredibly adept book writer like James Lapine, the moral is layered in a nebulous web of metaphor and what we might think of as almost a pseudo-philosophical discourse, which aims to, I think, explore the very core of the human condition, what it means to be human, and to embrace the sort of ugliness and the dark side of being human, being selfish, being venal, being malfeasant. These are all part of what it means to be human. And we see it on full display, especially in the first act. And we'll get to that because it's of paramount importance to the arc and the trajectory of the musical itself. Of course, Sondheim helps us. How does he help us? By leading us along through this very dark, we might even think of it as a wooded path, where it's very easy to lose one's way. There are all sorts of metaphors here. But Sondheim helps us, not with a breadcrumb trail, but with a sonic breadcrumb trail. And this, of course, is the concept of the leitmotif. A leitmotif is a cell of notes. Could be a melody, which would be a horizontal cell of notes, or it could be some kind of harmonic cell of notes that forms a harmony or a chord. And by introducing each character with a very specific motif, what Sondheim is able to do is to allow us, the audience, to remember who these characters are, who they are, and what they're about, what they are endeavoring to accomplish, what their mission is, what their objectives are, and how they relate to the events unfolding around them. So even though this is a very daunting musical in many ways, after all, it is Sondheim, and as we have established in our last lecture, Sondheim's musical vocabulary is an incredibly sophisticated one. His music inclines towards polyphony rather than homophony. Polyphony can be described as the simultaneous unfolding of independent lines. Sondheim's sense of vertical harmony is incredibly complex, with, I would say, an unprecedented degree of dissonance, at least for Broadway, for that idiom. Broadway is an idiom that's not known for having a preponderance of dissonant phrases, but in Sondheim we get a lot of dissonance. Often it's connected specifically to events unfolding on stage. I think of the moment in Sweeney Todd when Benjamin Barker, aka Sweeney Todd, is reflecting on how Judge Turpin molested his wife. And he sings the word, he says, there was a woman and she was beautiful. And on the word beautiful, we get this tortured, dissonant chord. And it's so meaningful. It's ironic in a way that the word beautiful would be painted that way. But this is Stephen Sondheim. The man was incredibly adroit when it came to finding combinations of notes that seemed perfectly suited to conveying what's unfolding on stage. We're going to begin our program tonight by looking at the opening number. And you can see here it's split into 9 parts. And just look at the number of characters who are appearing on stage in this opening number. I believe it's a total of 12. We have a narrator, Cinderella, Jack, a baker and his wife, Cinderella's stepmother and 2 stepsisters, Florinda and Lucinda, Jack's mother, Little Red Riding Hood. Later on, a witch is going to appear. The witch, of course, is a very important character in this musical. And we will revisit the other characters as they come on and off stage during the opening number. If we turn to the opener, what we'll see is that a narrator introduces the events. And typically in a staging, what you'll see is the character playing the narrator will be dressed in a suit, sometimes a 3-piece suit, and he'll look very official, almost like, dare I say, a scholar, an academician, or perhaps even a librarian. And the character will pick up a book and begin to read it, as if the story that they're narrating is contained in the book that they're reading. Musically speaking, we begin with Cinderella. And Cinderella's first line is going to be echoed by most of the characters who are going to sing this, I wish, a whole step. I wish, D to E. Lapine, in writing the book, was, I think, intending to provide us with a very pointed and very, I think, scathing commentary on the whole phenomenon of wishing, what it means to wish. And this is so contrary, isn't it, to the typical fairy tale, think of Disney and when you wish upon a star, and wishing wells and things of that nature. Here, Lapine is introducing the idea that a wish is a dangerous thing. And of course, that idiom is a widely embraced one, I think, in many cultures. Be careful what you wish for. Cinderella is going to start with I wish, and then all the other characters who sing are going to echo her by singing I wish. And the word I wish, or the words, are sung on a whole step, or what we call in music theory a major second interval. A major second is a very simple interval. Do to re, if you like solfege, and I doubt there's anyone on the call who does like solfege, but if you do, you'll know that interval as a whole step. I wish. Wishing is simple. Uttering words, fantasizing about something, that's simple. But actuating that wish, striving towards it in a way that requires the exertion of effort, that's very difficult. But expecting things to magically manifest, that simplicity is conjured up here by Sondheim in this very simple interval that he uses to characterize these words, I wish. Cinderella sings more than anything, and when she sings those words, we'll hear another one of her central leitmotifs, more than anything. So this figuration that goes down the whole step, up a perfect fourth, and then drops down. More than life, more than jewels. Notice what happens when Jack comes in. I wish, same notes, same interval. We're going to go through the first number in a great amount of detail. We won't have time to do the whole show, obviously, in that much detail. We would need a semester of graduate seminars for that. But we can certainly put the first number under the microscope, and it's a very, very long number. Let me summarize basically what's happening for those who are not initiated in the Into the Woods story. Cinderella, of course, is wishing, well, some of you might guess what she's wishing for. She's wishing to go to the festival. She wants to go to a festival so she can dance with the prince. The prince that she's going to meet is just about everything we imagine him to be. He's dashing and debonair. Might I say, he is charming. But it turns out that the prince is a heel. He's not really a good guy. And even though Cinderella gets her wish, she's not going to be very content with it. And by the second act, she's drifted away from the prince. When she confronts him, by the way, about his infidelity in the second act, the prince has a great line. He says, I was raised to be charming, not sincere. Well, that's Cinderella's wish. What about Jack's wish? For those of you who are familiar with the story of Jack and the Beanstalk, it begins with Jack, who lives with a sharp-tongued mother, no father, no siblings. It's just Jack and mom. And Jack wishes that his cow, whose name is Milky White, would give him some milk. And this is there's a twofold reason for this. One is that Jack requires sustenance. He's a growing boy after all. But the other is that his mother is adamant that if Milky White can't produce milk, Milky White must be taken to market to be sold so that they can buy food. Unfortunately for Jack, Milky White is his best and only friend. So Jack is desperate for Milky White to produce milk so that he might be able to keep his best friend at home. The baker and his wife have perhaps the most of the legitimate of all the wishes. Notice when the baker sings, I wish, same interval, D to E, a whole step. Now we start to see Sondheim's approach to polyphony as the characters begin to sing simultaneously. Here they're singing in unison, but the baker's wife also sings, I wish. So now we've got four characters wishing. The baker and the wife are wishing for a child. Here's another one of Cinderella's leitmotifs. Da-dum, ba-da-da-da-dum, ba-dum. The king is giving a festival. Often this is played as a fanfare in the brass. There are a couple of trumpets and horns in the pit. This is a pit that requires about 20 musicians. And so most of the fanfare music obviously is going to be reserved for the princes. There are two in the first act. One is Cinderella's prince, and he gets this theme when he runs into the forest to chase after Cinderella. This is the theme that plays often in the trumpets. More than life, I wish. I wish to go to the festival. More than riches. I wish to go to the ball. I wish my cow would give us some milk. More than anything, I wish we had a child. So this is the baker and his wife. They are desperate for a child, but for some mysterious reason, which will be explored in the show, they are infertile. They're incapable of having a child. Poor old Jack, please, pal, squeeze, pal. He's just begging Milky White to produce some milk. And so Sondheim, conveys that through these rising, ascending intervals, as if to convey a sense of urgency and desperation on Jack's part. I want to go to the festival. Notice Cinderella climbing here into the soprano register. Jack sings, and they're all singing about different things, but what happens at the end of the system? All in unison, back on that major second interval. I wish. It's really, really cleverly done. And this is just the first 30 seconds of the show, my friends. If you were to see the show and feel confused by it, I think immersing oneself in the score is very helpful, because hearing those leitmotifs is really going to be of paramount importance. And it must be said that the concept of leitmotivic organization and giving the characters distinct musical cells and fragments and ideas that conjure up their very identities is an important one in musical theater. And I think you can make the argument that few do it better than Sondheim. He really is, I think, in terms of leitmotivic development, the absolute apogee, the apotheosis even. And that might sound hyperbolic, but that's at least one professor's opinion. We open now with the first number in Into the Woods, which again, visually would be something of a spectacle, because you'd be seeing quite a few characters on stage, spotlights here and there, characters going hither and yon, coming on and off stage, and all of it anchored, by the way, in some of the simplest music in the entire show. It's basically just a C major 7 chord going to a B minor 7 chord. And I think that was done by Sondheim deliberately to evoke this sense of simplicity, because wishing is simple. But remember, I think the cautionary nature of this story. Lapine and Sondheim were beaming a message to the audience, and that message is very clear by the time we get to the end of the second act. Be very careful what you wish for. Here we go. This is the original cast featuring great actors. Joanna Gleason, who sang The Baker's Wife, won the Tony Award in 1988 for Best Actress. Sondheim won for Best Score. It must be said that Into the Woods did not fare especially well in 1988 at the Tony Awards, and that really was a consequence of the fact that a 1986 show, which started on the West End, came to Broadway in 1987, and therefore was part of the 1988 Tony Awards. Many of you are doing the math. If you're a Broadway historian, you're thinking, okay, a British show, so a show by an English composer, from 1986, and you figured out it was Phantom of the Opera. And Phantom of the Opera dominated the Tonys in 1988. I am not suggesting that Phantom is an inferior show for everybody. Some people may really like Phantom, and Phantom is a great show in its own way. But Andrew Lloyd Webber's harmonic vocabulary is completely different from Sondheim. So I often say it's like comparing apples and pomegranates. They're very, very different styles of musical theater. Here we go with the opening number, and we're listening for that opening motif, the whole step, and then these descending intervals. More than anything, more than life. The wishing is what's really important here. And by putting it up on this very simple interval, Sondheim is telling us, hey, making a wish is really easy. You want to throw a coin in a well? Do you want to stare up at the firmament and wish on a star? That's really easy. But the consequences of having that wish come true, what it often means for people in your periphery, people who are not even on your radar, can be impacted by one's wishing. And that's a really central theme here throughout the musical. We begin with the opening number. This is a great example of Sondheim using dissonance to shade characters in sinister tones here. As Cinderella's step family, her stepmother and sisters, are laughing at her, this grimy, soot-covered girl with dirty fingernails, who, of course, shines with a sort of inner beauty, and is the only member of the family who seems to have a backbone or a moral compass, but she's being derided here. And look at, even if you don't read music, you can see all the symbols here: flat signs, natural signs, sharp signs. Sondheim is creating increasingly dissonant clusters as they are laughing and mocking Cinderella. We're back to Jack now, and we meet Jack's mother. And Jack's mother is described as, being not quite beautiful, but being rather acid-tongued, being very sharp-witted, to be sure, but not the most sympathetic person and not the most empathetic character. All three. All right, did you notice that Jack's mother sings the same interval, I wish, and of course the next character to come in is Little Red. Little Red is also one of these characters who has a wish and comes across in her very first scene as being incredibly rapacious and not very thoughtful. She kind of barges into the baker's shop where the baker and his wife are making breads and pies and things of that nature, and she just starts helping herself, stuffing things into her arms until she can't carry anymore, and she has the temerity to ask for a basket. She says, I sort of hate to ask it, but do you have a basket? The baker's wife has a soft spot, clearly, for Little Red, and we can understand why. She's desperate for a child, and Little Red Riding Hood, and as the name suggests, there's the diminutive Little Red, suggests there's something very innocent and childlike about Little Red. And so the baker's wife allows her to help herself gratis to the baked goods. So now we've got a key change. Little Red is going to sing, I wish it's not for me. Oh gosh, I'm not just loading these loaves of bread and pies and cakes and things for myself. I'm taking it to my granny in the woods. You can see, again, if you don't read music, you don't have to. This just looks like such a cluster. And it really, that's the term we use in music theory. We call this a cluster. It's a series of notes that are sequentially related. That is to say, they are conjunct, they're stepwise notes. And so it creates this very dissonant sound. And this is a theme that's going to come back, especially for Cinderella's step family. And now the spotlight shifts back to Little Red, who, not content with all the food she's already pilfered, is now asking for a sticky bun. Okay, did you notice that in the score? Did you hear it? The trumpet part? Bum ba da ba ba bum ba bum. It's the I wish to go to the festival. As Cinderella is singing to the birds. By the way, Cinderella, of course, as many of you know from the original fairy tale, Cinderella has an ability to communicate with birds. So as she's singing this sort of melody, which is meant to evoke perhaps the flightiness of the avian species, here the trumpet comes back playing the fanfare. Bum ba da ba ba bum ba bum. which is exactly what Cinderella sings in the opening page. I wish to go to the festival. So the leitmotivic nature of Sondheim's score on full display here. We're not even 3 minutes into the piece. It gets more intense as the trumpet plays. I'm going to play it one more time just to listen for the trumpet in this section. You can't help but admire Sondheim's incredible sense of lyrical flow here and the creativity. We've no time to sit and dither while her withers wither with her. Well, you don't have to be a wordsmith yourself to appreciate the masterful display of the English language or command of the English language on display here. Her withers, that is to say, the way we measure the height of animals, wither with her. And no one keeps a cow for a friend. Jack's mother is not the least bit sympathetic to Jack. She's worried quite literally about putting bread on the table, which creates another tie into the baker and his wife and the sort of the gap between them and paradoxical nature of their wants. That is to say, Jack's family, Jack and his mother, desperately need bread on the table. The baker has plenty of bread on the table, presumably, but doesn't have any children, no progeny of his own, as he and his wife have suffered through a long spell of infertility, and it's nebulous to them why that's the case. It's going to be explained very shortly as we segue into the next part. All of that, by the way, was just part one. Now we go into the Woods theme. And you can see what Sondheim does here. He puts it in this jaunty, swinging, adventurous sounding meter. Into the woods, it's time to go. I hate to so this sort of long short combination, which is afforded to the lyrical flow by the 12/8 meter, really allows Sondheim to create this sense of adventure. Now, all of the characters will wind up heading into the woods for different reasons. Little Red is the first to sing it because she is essentially got the simplest quest, or at least it seems simple. She is going to take some food to her granny, who it turns out lives in a house carved into a tree in the woods. So here's Little Red starting this jaunty theme that represents the sense of adventure that is conjured up when we use the phrase into the woods. By the way, we are probably more familiar and more used to using the phrase out of the woods, aren't we, in English language? When we say out of the woods, it means out of trouble, doesn't it? We're not out of the woods yet, right? That's a very, I think, frequently used idiomatic expression, which essentially means, we haven't cleared the obstacles, we haven't surmounted the challenges, we haven't, gotten around the problems that we have to fix. We're not out of the woods. So into the woods is, the main refrain here, but they're also going to sing into the woods and out of the woods. And that's significant. We'll listen to that and then we'll reflect on it. The sort of flippant attitude of Little Red is on full display here, right? There are a couple of lines which are significant. I would say most significant is a line which we'll revisit at the end of the program, where she says, the woods are just trees, and the trees are, well, just wood. There's, nothing to fear, she says. The way is clear, the light is good. And then, of course, as she's stuffing her face, I sort of hate to ask it, but do you have a basket? Notice what she says about grandmother. Did anyone catch this line? Never can tell what lies ahead, for all that I know. She's already dead. The moral ambivalence conveyed by Little Red in this one line, I think, is a sort of paradigmatic example of how Lapine and Sondheim thought about, the human default attitude towards the welfare of others. That is to say, it is an ambivalent one, that our sense of morality is fundamentally an ambivalent one. And this is a theme that's going to come up over and over again in the musical. So the plan up for us is to get through the first number, which, as we said, is sprawling and staggering in scope. And then we'll just look at a few short clips, and then we'll spend time at the end of the program looking at the second act. And we're really going to jump to the end of the second act. And if anybody has any questions along the way, feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat function. So again, never can tell what lies ahead, for all that I know. She's already dead. But the music doesn't change here. We don't get any sense of, modulation to a minor key. That's just the end. That's the cadence. In other words, Little Red says it, and it's a rather flippant line to say about your grandmother who you're supposedly going to, who's ailing and you're supposedly going to take food to so that her condition might be ameliorated. This is a sort of a strange line if you just hear it in passing, but when you think about it as representative of the creators of the work and how they meant for this line to reflect the sort of moral ambivalence that characterizes so much of humanity, I think that's lofty and it's pseudo philosophical, but I think it is an important part of this musical. Into the Woods and Home Before Dark. Here's Cinderella's music, and this might be thought of as her bird theme. It's quite dissonant, I should say. And she's talking to the birds who have just helped her clear out the lentils out of the fireplace so that now she might go to the ball. Well, do you think her stepmother and stepsisters will allow her to go to the ball? I mean, after all, she's performed the task that they set for her to clean the lentils out of the fireplace. Of course they won't. Here we go. Before we go on, let's take a look at something that Cinderella sings here. A couple of very important lines. She says, "So be nice, Cinderella. Good, Cinderella. Nice, good, good, nice." Then she asks, what's the good of being good if everyone is blind? She mentions blindness here. For those of you who know the show, what happens to Cinderella's stepsisters at the end of the first act? Well, those of you who know the show well know that they're blinded by birds. The birds peck out their eyes. And in the second act, when they have to defeat the giantess, how do they defeat the giantess? Again, through the birds blind the giantess. The concept of, or the theme of good versus nice is going to be addressed directly by a character we've yet to meet, but who appear very soon in the drama. And that, of course, is the witch. What does the witch say? Well, she says, I'm not good. I'm not nice. I'm just right, as in correct. That's such a great line. And again, it reflects so much of the moral that is being projected here by the musical by the time we get to the second act. The idea that the witch isn't good is one of, that is perhaps a subjective stance to take. What does it mean to be good or to be bad? What does it mean to be nice? Those are subjective things, perhaps. But being right is objective. Either you're right or you're wrong. And the witch says, I'm not good or nice, but I am right. And, the idea that witches can be good, even when they appear sinister, is a theme that is revisited here. One of the things about the witch, and we'll meet her momentarily, is, because she is, in the first act, dressed as an old harridan, a crone with, a warty face and crooked teeth and that sort of thing, a stereotypical witch, the kind of thing we might expect from a character designated in the score simply as the witch. She doesn't even get a name like Glinda or Elphaba. She's simply the witch. And because this, disgusting harridan crone with the warty face seems so outwardly sinister, we're inclined to think of the witch as the bad guy in the story. That's another thing that Sondheim and Lapine would, I think, want to challenge. The idea of outward appearance, of course, being not reflective of inner substance. That's an old thing, and that's not unique to this show, and it's certainly not something that was created by Sondheim and Lapine. The truth is, though, that when the witch first appears, she seems sinister, but when we really consider her background, her stance, I think it becomes very obvious that there's more to the story than that. Now, we visit the baker and his wife, and we learn a little bit about them. You can see some of the underscoring there. The witch shows up. She happens to live next door to the baker and his wife, and what does she say? They don't actually include this in the studio recording, but you can see it here. She points her staff at the baker's wife, and she says, "Oh, it's not what I wish." And she points to her belly, and she says, "It's what you wish. Nothing cooking in there now, is it?" And then she goes on to tell the couple that she has cursed them. She's hexed them. And the baker is vexed by this. He doesn't understand why or how this happened. And now we're going to find out why. Now, notice when the witch, I was going to say sings, but sings is not the right word. Actually, the correct word here would be what? What do we call it when somebody speaks in a very specifically metered rhythm. Well, many of you are perhaps saying, well, isn't that a kind of rapping? And that's true. What happens next is the witch's rap. So long before Hamilton, long before Into the Woods, long before In the Heights, you have Into the Woods. And this is a show, again, from 1987 that is often described as the very first example of rap making its way into Broadway, into musical theater. And, of all things, it's in a Sondheim musical. And what is she rapping about? Her greens, nothing but greens, parsley, pepper, cabbages, and celery. Now, the most important of the greens, I should say, are the beans. And they're going to get their own leitmotif, and we'll spend some time talking about that. All right, so here we discover something interesting. The baker's father clambered over into the witch's garden one night, and he stole from her. He rooted through her rutabaga, took arugula, all sorts of greens. And all of this is bad enough. And it's going to, the consequence of that is that the witch is going to essentially kidnap the baby that's born to the baker's father and mother, that is to say, the baker's sister. We learn that the baker's sister is Rapunzel and that she's been locked away in a tower that nobody can access unless you climb up Rapunzel's golden hair. The witch does this in a sort of reprisal. Hey, you steal from me and I'll steal from you. I'll take your child. And of course, she develops a relationship with Rapunzel, raises her on her own, and thinks of herself as Rapunzel's real mother, and more sort of the parenting themes that are so prominent in this musical come up through that relationship. We've already seen the theme of parenting through the baker and his wife, who have no child but are desperate to be parents and indeed do become parents by the end. We've seen the theme of parenting come up in the case of Cinderella, whose stepmother mistreats her and abuses her and treats her as a second-class citizen compared to her stepsisters. And we've also seen the theme of parenting now with the witch and her stolen daughter, I should say, the daughter she stole from the baker's father, and that is Rapunzel. But all that, the rutabaga, the arugula, everything else, that doesn't bother the witch too much. But what does bother her, we're going to find out. It's the magic beans. All right, so the beans were stolen. And what do we know about these beans? Not much, other than they have certain magical properties. And the beans are going to be at the center of the story. The magical properties of the beans will be obvious to those of us who guess where they'll wind up. And if you guess that they'll wind up thrown on the ground where they'll sprout magical beanstalks that reach up into the realm of the giants, you are correct. We still have to resolve the quest instructions, if we want to call them that, for the other characters. The Cinderella is desperate to go to the ball. Jack is desperate for Milky White to produce milk, so he doesn't have to take her to market. But Jack's mother says, listen, it's over. You got to take Milky White and don't sell her for less than £5. Right. So I want to point out one of the most important musical things in the entire show. We're reading treble clef here. So this is B flat, E flat, F, D natural, C. And these 5 notes, which represent the 5 beans that will be used to purchase Milky White and set the cogs in motion for the lifting of the curse, are going to come back all throughout the show in so many different incarnations. It makes one's head spin. If we really comb through the score, we'll find it in so many different manifestations and configurations and permutations. But this is the core theme. And it sounds like this. Dum, bum, 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 bum. And it's going to come up over and over again. And after we finish the first number, we'll have time to quickly look at 4 or 5 different versions of that just in the first act alone. So this theme, do, 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 is going to come back. And it really, what it represents is the beans, but specifically the magic that the beans convey. Remember what the witch says. Well, he stole all my greens, the cabbage and celery and parsley and the rutabaga and all that. But what he really took that really set me off was he took my beans, the special beans. And that really is what causes the witch to set this vindictive curse, cursing the baker and his wife that their family tree would always be a barren one. So here's this theme again. I'm going to take it back just a couple of minutes. We're into the last third of the opening number. And listen for that theme. You can really feel how incredibly dissonant these clusters get, right? Sondheim probably uses, it would be an interesting graduate dissertation perhaps, but the use of dissonance here is, in my mind, unprecedented and unparalleled. There simply aren't any musicals I can think of that use this degree of harmonic clustering to create these deeply unsettling, dissonant vertical sonorities. And the theme is played while that cluster is being held in this sort of this shimmering synthesizer sound. It was the 80s, of course, so there's going to be a lot of synth in this score. And while that's playing, we hear this do 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 do, which will come back over and over again, and we'll see many examples. Well, here's da ba da ba 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 dum. There's Cinderella's princess theme, and theme that maybe is not only associated with the prince, but also. Oh, the mission is clear now. The baker and his wife have to venture into the woods. What do they need to procure? Well, four items, which I think when you listen to this score, those four items, they're so iconic, and we don't even have to guess where they're going to come from. We, of course, know. The cow is white as milk. Well, where are they going to get that from? Of course, Jack is on his way to market to sell poor old Milky White, whose withers are withering with her, according to Jack's mom. Uh, in order to procure the cape as red as blood, where would they get that? Of course, from Little Red. What about the hair as yellow as corn? But that's going to come from Rapunzel, naturally. And finally, the slipper as pure as gold. We know where that's going to come from. Cinderella. She's going to get this magical, through magic at her mother's grave. A beautiful ball gown and slippers will be conjured out of thin air for her so that she might get dressed and head to the festival where she will charm, well, none other than Prince Charming. Now they're all heading into the woods, and we get this convergence of the Into the Woods, the adventure theme, if we can call it that, this lilting, jaunty theme in 12/8. Into the woods, it's time to go, buddy, 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 badum, that theme. And all the characters who are venturing into the woods are going to converge on stage. So Cinderella obviously is heading to her mother's grave, which is in the woods. Little Red is going to visit her grand. Friends, what if I told you that that is only the opening number of the musical? It's 12 minutes long, and that's in the studio recording, which of course omits much of the dialogue and the underscoring and vamping that takes place. So figure in a typical performance, it would be closer to 15 minutes long, and that's just the opening number. Well, what's going to happen to these characters? First, let's consider the morality of the characters themselves. Are these good people? Are they noble, scrupulous, moral, decent, ethical? I think the answer becomes clear to us that maybe it's a little bit yes and a little bit no. For example, the baker is decidedly dismissive and even misogynistic towards his wife, right? What does he say? He says, I'm going to go get the items. The spell is on my house. And the baker's wife says, well, infertility is really, it's about us. The spell is on our house. And he says, no, I'm going to go. You stay put. I'm going to go get the items. And then he can't even remember what they are. And he has to wait for his wife to say, the cow is white as milk, the cape is red as blood. He doesn't even remember. He needs her desperately, but he's too blinded by his own machismo to even admit it. What about Little Red? Well, we've already established she's rapacious as anything. She comes into the baker's shop, helps herself to a bunch of free stuff, claiming it's for her ailing grandmother. And then, as we'll find out, she eats almost all of it before she even gets to grandmother's house. When the baker spies Little Red in the woods and he sees the cape is red as blood, what does he do? He just tries to steal it from her. He says, oh, that's a beautiful cape. And then he just takes it and runs off. And it's only when Little Red begins screaming and shrieking that he runs back onto stage and he gives it back and says, I just really wanted to make sure that you really like this cape. So there is humor there, but it's also, I think, very telling that his first impulse is when he sees something he wants is to just take it. What about the other characters? Well, Jack comes across as earnest, although perhaps a bit simple, but he too will be guilty of theft. When he is walking through the woods with Milky White, the baker and his wife see him. And she says, "A cow as white as milk." And so they go to pay him, but they don't have anything. And Jack says, "Well, my mother says I need at least 5 pounds." Let's watch that scene. It's very short. Let's see, this is at 23 minutes. So we're going to watch the original cast. So you'll hear Chip Zien as the baker, Joanna Gleason as the baker's wife. We heard on the cast recording just now that was, of course, Bernadette Peters, a frequent Sondheim collaborator who originated the role of Dot in Sunday in the Park with George. She sings the role of the witch here, and Ben Wright plays the role of Jack. Ben Wright would have been like 19 years old at the time. So she sees Milky White, and she tries to convey to her husband that they basically are going to hoodwink and swindle Jack. Did you notice that? Which note sounded? Da bum 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 bum. That exact interval profile, starting on this note, down a perfect fifth, up a whole step, down a minor third, down a whole step. So that theme that we talked about that was playing when the witch was recounting her story of the beans being stolen plays again here, note for note with nothing around it. So it's very obvious here that that theme is associated with the beans. Now notice what's happening. The baker and his wife have no they have no reason to believe that the beans are actually magical. They found it in the pocket of a coat, a neglected coat that belonged to the baker's father. So they have no reason to think these beans are actually magical. After all, the witch didn't say much about them, other than that they were special. And so, the baker's wife clearly is attempting to swindle Jack. She says, "What are we going to do with beans? Oh, yes, of course, those beans. Sure, yeah, they're worth at least £1 each." So she's being duplicitous and trying to bamboozle Jack out of his cow. But remember, they're doing it not out of malice or out of greed, but really out of desperation. They desperately want a child, and they know that to procure the reagents for the potion that will lift the spell, they need a cow as white as milk, and they've just encountered one. All right, let's continue now, and we're going to go to Rapunzel's theme, which is just a couple of minutes later. Now, we didn't really get to talk about Rapunzel all that much. Other than that, we said that Rapunzel is the baker's long-lost sister, and that she was essentially kidnapped at birth as a reprisal measure because the witch was exacting vengeance for the baker's father stealing her greens. Remember, that ba 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 ba. It's in a different time signature, but it's the same. Do 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 do. So starting on the note, down a perfect fifth, up a whole step, down a minor third, and down a whole step. So that theme that we heard first when the witch was rapping about the beans, then when the baker and his wife pay Jack for his cow with the beans, and now Rapunzel. Now, why would Rapunzel be singing the bean theme? Remember, Rapunzel was essentially abducted because her father stole the beans from the witch. So her fate and her identity, being this sort of damsel who's trapped in the tower, is intimately connected to the sins of the father, which is, of course, one of the major themes in the show. You can tell here from this production that this is very much a funny show. There's a lot of moments where I think as audience members, we can't help but guffaw. And I haven't spoken at all about the Disney film yet, and we won't have time to talk about it. But I will say that the Disney film from 2014, directed by Rob Marshall, gets a lot of things wrong. One of the things that the film does is it siphons all of the humor out of this very funny musical. It also, I think, dilutes the impact of the music by having it sung at slower tempos and in keys that are different than the keys that Sondheim wrote them in. You may say, what's the difference if you sing it in A major or in C major? Well, if you take the music and you transpose it down a whole step, a minor third, whatever it happens to be, it will lose a certain amount of impact. If the high notes aren't as high, it simply won't ring as much. And often what we find in these film adaptations is that directors will cast actors who are considered A-list actors, but they're not A-list singers. And the best example, the most egregious, glaring example of that, of course, would be the casting of Javert in the Les Miserables movie, where Russell Crowe doesn't even bother trying to sing most of the notes, it seems. He's just sort of doing a Sprechstimme, sort of speak singing through a lot of it. And Russell Crowe, a fine actor, not the greatest singer. And in the movie, there are some excellent vocal performances, notably from Anna Kendrick, who plays Cinderella, and Meryl Streep, who plays the witch. But I think that's really where I would draw the line at great. Everything else is either good or less than good. All right. What about Jack? He's been swindled, right? He's got this handful of beans in exchange for his beloved cow. The beans, he has no reason to think they're worth anything. And when he comes home, he presents them to his mother, who berates him and excoriates him for being so dim-witted that he allowed himself to be swindled. And the beans are cast to the ground, where, of course, they sprout a magic beanstalk. Jack races up the beanstalk, and he comes back with wonderment and a twinkle in his eye. There are giants in the sky. Let's go ahead and listen to that, and that is at 38 minutes and 23 seconds in the film. Notice what Jack sings when he arrives. Did you hear that? There are giants in the sky. Do, 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 do. It's that same down a fifth, up a whole step, down a minor third, down a whole step. Jack is singing the bean theme. Wow, why do we suppose he's singing the bean theme? Of course, he's just come down from the beanstalk, and he's been sort of mesmerized by what he's seen up in the sky, the realm of the giants. And it's a delightful number. It's a short number, like many of the numbers in Into the Woods, besides the opening and the Act 1 closer and the Act 2 closer. They're quite short, and they're really delightful. And in this one, Jack sings about witnessing this sort of otherworldly sensation of seeing a giant, a real-life giant. And unfortunately, Jack, being human, sees gold, and he steals it. And so he races down with the gold, and he begins stealing treasure from the giants. He's going to steal gold. Eventually, he's going to steal the golden harp from the giants. And this is going to set the cogs in motion for much of the destruction wrought by the giant in Act 2. What about the other characters here? Well, we're going to skip to Act 2 momentarily, so I'll just summarize briefly what happens in the rest of Act 1. The baker and his wife. Eventually, they do procure the things they need. Little Red is devoured by who else would it be? The big bad wolf. And after the baker rescues her by cutting open the belly of the wolf, she rewards the baker by giving him the red cape as red as blood. She delightfully regales him. She says, "My grandmother is going to make me a new cape fashioned out of wolf skin." Go figure. The other ingredients are reagents for the potion. Well, the cow is white as milk. They get that from Jack, and they lose it and regain it. Then the cow dies and is resurrected, but nonetheless, they get the cow. What else? The hair is yellow as corn. Well, the baker's wife is going to save the day by finding Rapunzel's tower and cutting her hair. So they get the hair as yellow as corn. It winds up being corrupted by the witch, and they can't use it, so they just use the silk of an actual cob of corn. And then finally, the slipper is pure as gold. Of course, they're going to get that from Cinderella. Specifically, it's the baker's wife who gets it from Cinderella. So notice that in procuring these reagents for the potion that's going to lift the spell, the baker's wife does most of the heavy lifting. The baker sort of fumbles around for much of Act 1. Even though he wanted to leave her home, and he admonishes her at first for showing up in the woods, he's, of course, very grateful at the end. So the witch imbibes this potion, and she lifts the spell, and she sheds her ugly facade and becomes very beautiful. In the original production, again, it's Bernadette Peters in that role. The other characters, what happens to them? Well, Cinderella, she goes to the festival and is chased by the prince, not once, not twice, but thrice. And each time she evades the prince. But the last time the prince sets a trap for her. He spills this gooey pitch on the stairs of the palace, the steps. And Cinderella sings a song at the end of Act 1, one of the best songs in the show, I think, called On the Steps of the Palace. where she decides instead of trying to wrench her shoe free, she's just going to leave it there for him and let him sort of make the next move. And what he does is he goes around looking for the foot that fits the slipper. This is that moment I alluded to at the beginning of the program where Cinderella's stepsisters literally mutilate their feet so that they can try to fit it into the slipper. But the prince is not duped. He's not hoodwinked as easily as Jack is. And finally, he finds that Cinderella is the owner of the slipper, and they get married at the end of the first act. So it seems that everybody should be happy, right? Yeah, well, maybe they're not the most, morally, in a sort of a very black and white binary sense, they're not the most, scrupulous characters. After all, the baker is, I would say, exhibits a behavior towards his wife which is less than admirable. He admonishes her for helping him even when he desperately needs her help. Little Red selfishly eats all the food before she even arrives at grandmother's house. The baker tries to steal the cape from Little Red. The baker's wife tries to hoodwink Jack by convincing him that the beans are magical. She has no reason to believe they're magical, so she cheats him essentially. Jack goes into the realm of the giants by climbing up the beanstalk, and the first thing he does is he steals from them. He steals, gold and later the magic harp after Little Red dares him to retrieve it. And so all these characters are flawed, deeply flawed, we might say, and yet we can sort of understand why they do what they do. The baker and his wife, well, they do what they do because they're so desperate for a child that even if it means cheating a boy out of his cow, they'll do it. Little Red, well, as it turns out, she's young. She's the youngest character in the show, and children are foolish and she's selfish, and they tend to think only of themselves, or primarily of themselves at least, so perhaps it makes a little bit more sense. Jack steals from the giants, but remember, Jack's family is destitute. Jack sees the gold, and of course it makes sense that he would want to take it so that he can buy back Milky White, so he can have his best friend back, and so that he can provide for his mother. So even though these characters are flawed, there are at least explanations for why they act the way they do. The ending number in Act 1 is called Happily Ever After. And you might think, well, this seems like a story that is going to converge on a happy ending for all the characters, and we can all go home. And at this moment, I want to pause and talk about how Into the Woods is often done on the community theater, and especially at the high school level, occasionally at the college level, but it's really when it's done with a younger cast. And the way it's often done is by omitting the second act. Now, this might seem heretical to those of us who are not only devotees of the show, but of Broadway in general. How many shows would you just cut the entire second act? And what does that do to the structural integrity of the show? And more importantly, in Into the Woods, what does that do for the moral of the story as envisioned by Sondheim and Lapine? I would assert forcefully that if you cut the second act, you dilute, diminish, and in fact, completely subvert everything that this musical is about. The second act is necessary. It is of paramount importance here. The cornerstone principles espoused philosophically through the show's characters are contained in the second act, not the first act. If you watch the first act and end it, you think that it's okay to be selfish, it's okay to steal, it's okay to lie and cheat, and you get what you want and everybody's happily ever after. But that's not what happens. Summarizing very quickly, the baker and his wife, they have a child. But life for them is not easy because, after all, they have a screaming baby. Little Red is going about her business, causing mischief wherever she goes. Jack, of course, is living with his mother now, and they've got money and food and the like, and life is good for them. Cinderella is married to the prince, but the prince, this is true of both princes, both Rapunzel's prince and Cinderella's prince, they're amiable, certainly, and they're charming, but they're not moral, they're not decent, they're not scrupulous. They are sort of rapacious, but not for money. They're greedy for indulging their physical desires, namely that they like young, vulnerable women, like Cinderella or like Rapunzel. But once they've, established some kind of conquest, they're no longer interested. So Cinderella's prince is a philanderer and a Lothario, and she's aware of this, and of course she's discontent in that union as well. But the real conflict in Act 2 comes from the consequences at the end of Act 1. Remember I said that Jack stole from the giants? Well, the giant descended the beanstalk to investigate the theft of his gold. And while he was climbing down the beanstalk, Jack understanding the looming threat, cut the beanstalk, and it falls, and the giant plunges to his death. Now there is a murderous, marauding, vengeful giantess who is going around and trampling everybody and everything, from the villagers to the houses they live in to the castle itself. Everything is under siege by this giantess. And the giantess speaks off stage in a booming voice and says, "I want Jack." The other characters say, "Well, okay, you can have Jack." Again, they're very willing to offer up this sacrifice of this little boy, if it means that they can spare themselves. So they haven't really reformed. They haven't learned anything. They haven't learned anything, certainly, about community responsibility. They've all benefited from Jack's sticky fingers. And therefore, this is it's a very dark moment early in Act Two, when the characters have no sympathy for Jack, and many of them, not all, but many of them, are willing to give him up. Not everybody is. And Cinderella and the baker's wife especially are more sympathetic towards Jack. Meanwhile, Jack's mother is absolutely belligerent towards the giant, and she begins to berate the giant, or the giantess. And as she's provoking the giantess, she is, depending on the production, either impaled or clocked on the head by the steward of the prince, and she dies. So she is murdered, essentially, for provoking the giant, because the steward feels that provoking the giant is a dangerous move. What about the other characters? Well, Rapunzel is going to blunder into the giant's grasp and be squished. The baker's wife will run into the woods and have a tryst with, of all people, Cinderella's prince, who, after having an encounter with her and their physical, carnal knowledge of one another, he dashes off, leaving her breathless and wondering what the heck just happened. This causes her to lose her orientation in the woods, and she too blunders into the path of the giant and is trampled. So characters are dropping like flies. Jack's mother dies, Rapunzel dies, the baker's wife dies. The witch herself gets so fed up with the other characters, they sing a song, an ensemble number towards the end, which is classic Sondheim, very rapid declamation, text very complex. And it's called "Your Fault." And they all point the finger at each other. And it's very cleverly done. It really makes us contemplate the morality of the characters that we've been talking about all night. And it makes us think about the source of all this. Really, who is responsible for all the events that have transpired? And the answer, of course, is obvious. They're all responsible. Every single one of them has had a part to play here. And yet none of them can see it. All they can do is point fingers at one another and blame one another for the ill events that have befallen them. And they bewail the malfeasance of the other person without acknowledging their own flaws and their own missteps. And so the witch gets so fed up with this. Remember what she said at the beginning of the musical. She says, "I'm not good. I'm not nice. I'm just right." And seeing them incapable of distinguishing between right and wrong, she becomes so frustrated that she actually disappears and vanishes. And that's the last we see of the witch. This is towards the end of the second act. Most of the characters at this point have either vanished or they have been killed by the giantess. And this leads us into the last number that we'll look at this evening. And it's a very special number, I think, for many lovers of musical theater and people who really love Sondheim. It's a number called "No One Is Alone." And what's really special about it is that this is the moment when the characters who survive, and there are only four who survive. It's Jack, the baker, Cinderella, and Little Red. And they get together and they recognize, after spending an entire very, very loquacious episode in Your Fault, pointing fingers and blaming each other, very, very rapid declamation of text. After that moment occurs, they begin to realize that the only way that they'll possibly leap over this very impressive and seemingly insurmountable hurdle of the giant's presence, and the only way they can defeat the giant is together. And so now Cinderella will call upon her affinity and ability to communicate with birds, and Jack will use his dexterity and his nimbleness to essentially deliver the fatal blow to the giant. At any rate, the characters now sing this number, and what they sing about is, I think, really very much a sort of a microcosm of what this musical is about. What they're singing about is the fact that this is all transpired because, as they acknowledge, they've all had a part to play in it, and their own tunnel vision, as we might call it, their own tone deafness to their own culpability is what has exacerbated things and prevented them, impeded them from solving the problem earlier. And so much of the destruction and chaos and calamity and death that has preceded the singing of this number could have been circumvented if they had just been more open and honest with one another. In other words, that this is a song that is about community responsibility. This is a musical that is about community responsibility, and it's all encapsulated in this, which is over here towards the end of the show. I'm going to skip ahead. And again, the remaining characters here are Cinderella, Little Red, Jack, and of course the baker. There's Cinderella carrying the baby. After all, the baker's wife has been squished. And so now Cinderella becomes a sort of, it's implied, becomes a sort of surrogate mother to the baby.
I know. Remember.
And of course, the characters are successful in vanquishing the giant. I love the theme of this tune. And I also love the fact that Sondheim works very cleverly. And if you listen carefully, we won't have time to go over it with a fine-tooth comb. But the bean theme is contained there. But it's presented here in its most lyrical, most legato, most stably harmonized incarnation. It's transformed into a theme of utter sweetness, almost a saccharine in quality. And it comes at this moment of a great epiphany that the characters experience. It's the moment where they finally experience the growth and maturation that we as the audience have perhaps been yearning for all throughout the musical. And our frustration mounts and grows to a climax in Act Two. And finally, they point the finger in your fault and they spend 4 minutes blaming each other for what's transpired. And it's only when Jack realizes that his mother's been killed, and his first impulse, he says, oh, I'm going to kill the steward for doing that. And it's the baker, functioning as a sort of surrogate father himself, who puts a hand on his shoulder and says, don't do it. And then he sings about the consequences of one's action. Now, we talked in the very beginning of the program about wishing. Be careful what you wish for. When you wish for something, in order for that wish to come to fruition, for it to manifest, there often is a chain of events that have to be set off and achieved in order for it to come to fruition. And that chain of events can affect a great many people along the way, often detrimentally. And I think when we get to the end of the show, we realize that even though Sondheim has created this score where the word wish, I wish, in that very simple whole step, very isolated, not the least bit embellished or decorated in any way. It's a very simple interval to sing. It's a very simple interval to hear. And yet, the chaos that comes from those two simple words is profound. This is a very long musical, by the way. It is over 2.5 hours long in most productions, which means that with an intermission, you're looking at something close to 3 hours. So it's a very daunting musical, I think, for audiences. And I think for that reason, because the music is so complex, it is a Sondheim score after all, and because the duration of the show is so substantial, and because there are so many characters are present in this show, it can be very daunting, and it's frequently performed, but I often describe it as a show that's frequently done, but not frequently truly understood. But I think everybody here certainly has a better shot at truly understanding it than the average theater goer. So thank you for tuning into tonight's program. If you've got any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them. And I just want to thank the Darien Library for hosting this retrospective miniseries on Sondheim. You know, getting the chance to talk about Sunday in the Park last month, and having the opportunity to talk about Into the Woods. We've scratched the surface of Sondheim, but I think, you know, we would need many more programs to cover his entire oeuvre, his repertoire. But this gives us, I think, a real indication of how profound his skills as a composer and lyricist were. So thank you, everybody.
I don't see any questions, but someone raised their hand, which I can't unmute. So if you can type it into the Q&A or the chat, that would be great. Here we go. What is your theory on to how the characters move on from the events of the show?
Yeah, so we end Act One with a show called Happily Ever After. And when we get to the end of Act Two, um, there's an element of sort of taking us back to the very beginning. Remember where the narrator opens up the book and he blows the dust off of it and begins narrating it. We get a sense that this is the end of a story, but not the end of the story. And my sense is that, what the baker says it in No One Is Alone, and he says it very, very clearly. It's articulated. He says, people make mistakes. And that's sort of what I think of when I get to the end of this. The important thing is to grow from our mistakes, to learn from our mistakes. Otherwise, we're doomed to repeat them. And it takes us 2 hours and 20 minutes to get there. But when you hear the baker sing that, and it's sung to this, people make mistakes, it sort of leans up and it kind of wants to resolve, and it's very expressive in that way. So musically, my sense is that, this is the end of a chapter of the story. But the important thing is that the characters have learned, they've grown, the surviving ones, at least. The others have been squished. But of course, it has to happen. If you sanitize the show and take out the violence, as we often do with fairy tales, you remove a hugely important part of the show, which is that mistakes have consequences. Decisions have consequences, often, of a very severe nature. And we have to be very careful about what we wish for and how we wish for it and how we pursue it. So that's kind of how I think about this. Cindy, thank you so much for your comment. Thank you to everybody. Great. Madeline, I'm so glad you enjoyed it. Denny, thank you so much. Dorothy, much appreciated. And again, so many thanks to the Darien Library, because we get to indulge in these communal experiences. Talk about community. We get to indulge in these experiences because of the library and because of these locuses where we can come together, even virtually. So it's very special. And of course, I think it brings us closer together as a community. As I said at the beginning of the program, it really, I think, reminds us. And often we need a reminder, and today is one of those days, I think, where we need a reminder that life is filled with beautiful things, and this sort of humanistic spirit, which has been flourishing in us since time immemorial, but is really since the Renaissance, is such a core part, I think, of who so many of us are, and how we, make our way through the challenges of negotiating the various obstacles that come before us. Music and musical theater are a big part of that, I know, for many of us, and I'm very glad to have had the opportunity to talk about it tonight.
Gil, thank you for those lovely words and your analysis of Sondheim's Into the Woods. It was a really fascinating program. I hope everyone enjoyed it, and thank you for tuning in, and have a great night.
Have a good night, everybody.